Tēnā koutou katoa. Would you mind flicking up my slides, please? Okay, so just a very quick thank you to the organisers for having me here today, and thank you to Al for chairing this panel. 25 years ago, I was conducting fieldwork on the island of Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. Between 1988 and 1998, a highly complex hybrid conflict was fought on Bougainville. One part secessionist conflict between Bougainvilleans and Papua New Guineans, and the other part intra-Bougainvillean warfare, which was equally as bloody, if not more so, at a number of times. As we'll hear from Jim next, New Zealand was instrumental in spearheading peace talks in '97, which allowed for the New Zealand-led Truce Monitoring Group to be deployed to Bougainville, and this followed with the Australian multinational peace monitoring group, leading to the signing of the Bougainville Peace Agreement, which then paved the way for the roadmap for Bougainville's political status, culminating in the referendum for independence in 2019, which saw roughly 87.4% of voter turnout, and of that, 97.7% voted in favour of independence. But while I was on Bougainville, I was referred to a local saying which has resonated with me since, and I'll just let you read that for a moment. Because over the past 5 years, I have been reminded again and again of these words, and what it means for the Pacific as external interests in the region have waxed and waned depending on the geopolitical importance placed on the region. And right now, the Pacific Islands region is experiencing heightened interest as a consequence of strategic competition. Strategic competition between the United States and its allies and partners on the one hand and China on the other intensified in the region probably around 5-6 years ago, really started to pick up, although obviously in about 10 years prior to that, it was starting to churn over. But in April 2022, when Solomon Islands and China signed the Security Pact, things really started to kick in. So setting aside the strategic considerations, the raft of strategic considerations, which are very much part of this conversation and certainly can unpack a little bit during Q&A with respect to the type of region the region would like to see, as well as the agency and sovereignty of Pacific Island countries. Concerns about the effects of strategic uncertainty on the region led Pacific Islands forum leaders to highlight the impact of the increasingly complex geopolitical environment on member countries. In the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, which is really the Blue Pacific Narrative Roadmap, launched last year, forum leaders agreed that long-standing security threats emanating from ongoing geopolitical and geostrategic positioning by major powers in the region, they do say posturing in another statement, by major powers in the region are impacting regional politics and security considerations. So over the past 5 years, a lot of my research has been concerned with this intersection, how strategic competition in the Pacific is impacting the region, and also how it's being impacted and shaped by local security dynamics. So I'm going to focus today, though, on one element of this, and that is the competition for influence in the Solomon Islands, and particularly how that's manifesting in the security sector. So security sectors in the Pacific have been identified as areas where there had been increased partner engagement and where competing and non-aligned security partners could overwhelm and subsequently undermine peace and security efforts. So the bottom line essentially is that in the case of the Solomon Islands, following the country switching diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in 2019, there are now competing security stakeholders, Australia and China primarily, each competing to provide security assistance to a country with a recent history of conflict and instability. So I'm just going to touch very briefly on that period because it's an important reminder that conflict is not a distant memory and it continues to fuel insecurity. So in 1998, Solomon spiraled into conflict and lawlessness. This period between 98 and 2003 was known as the tensions, although the name doesn't actually quite convey the level of fear and violence of those years. On 24th of July 2003, at Henderson Airport, just outside Honiara, the population welcomed the Australian-led regional assistance mission to Solomon Islands, which New Zealand was obviously a critical part of, with a placard stating, 4 years in hell, free at last. The conflict, characterised by civil unrest and lawlessness sparked by fighting between the rival militant groups from the islands of Guadalcanal and Malaita, displaced nearly 10% of the population on the island of Guadalcanal and killed hundreds through both battle-related deaths and also the disruption, the indirect consequences of war, such as the disruption of supply routes to remote health services. The numbers of rape and other forms of sexual exploitation and abuse escalated on both sides. The capital, Honiara, on the island of Guadalcanal, became an enclave for Malaitans, with much of the fighting occurring in the environs and hinterlands of the town. Catholic priest Norman Arkwright, who wrote about that time, spoke of a river of refugees, the west of Guadalcanal, as they fled into Honiara. And an elderly man told me in 2005 that we were running like dogs. By 2003, the country was languishing in political, economic, and criminal turmoil, and the capital was brought effectively to a standstill. Significantly, elements of the National Police, the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force, were complicit in the conflict, and large caches of weapons were, from the police armories were stolen and fueled the ongoing violence. Long-standing grievances over inequitable and uneven economic development, divisions between provincial and national governments, deep frustrations over corruption, and the capturing of the state by commercial interests such as Malaysian logging companies, led to the tensions and the subsequent deployment of Ramsay. Between 2003 and 2019, though, there was an uneasy peace, punctuated by riots in 2006 and 2019. In November 2021, you may all recall the scenes on the television where riots again erupted in Honiara, following a peaceful march calling for the resignation of the current Prime Minister, Manasseh Sogavare, and then which led primarily by people from the island of Malaita and which subsequently deteriorated into violence. And this again, this violence, the riots were fueled by these very same triggers and frustration, a sense of alienation and disenfranchisement. And they were a stark reminder that the domestic drivers and dynamics which led to the civil conflict still remained unresolved. In response to the riots in 2021, and at the request of the Solomon Islands government, Australia again deployed New Zealand under the Australia-Solomon Islands bilateral security treaty, deploying a police-led mission, the Solomon Islands International Assistance Force, to assist in the provision of safety and security of persons and property. And again, here Aotearoa was part of that. At the time of the riots in 2021, which saw the targeting and burning of Chinatown, which was frequently an object throughout the riots over the couple of decades, and leading to the deaths of 3 Solomon Island nationals, China asked Solomon Islands to take all necessary measures to protect Chinese individuals and institutions. The following month, Solomon Islands accepted China's offer of riot equipment and 6 Ministry of Public Security police liaison officers to equip and train the national police. And the China police liaison team arrived in country in January 2022. Strategic competition may have been a spark, very clearly, behind the riots, but it was also a pawn. And this is where that intersection between strategic competition and local political interests and ambitions is really critical to understand. China, Taiwan, and the United States have jostled for influence in Solomon Islands since the switch in 2019. In Malaita, particularly, sometimes called sort of the renegade province of Malaita, the former premier, Daniel Sudani, opposed the switch from Taiwan to China and has leveraged Taiwan's eagerness to retain a foothold in Solomon Islands, oh dear, leading to accusations, by the national government that Malaita is in breach of the national One China policy. This has been further exacerbated by US engagement in Malaita, in the province, bypassing national mechanisms, and China also has run a disruptive campaign out of its embassy in Honiara, effectively a public diplomacy campaign, claiming that actions by Malaitan leaders were illegitimate, and also alleging that Australia and the United States had actually encouraged the unrest in Honiara. Solomon Islands Prime Minister Sogavare used geopolitics as a gambit also. Seeking to divert attention away from the domestic drivers of the unrest, he blamed foreign powers for influencing Malaitan discontent. And while attributing the unrest in Solomon Islands solely to geopolitical maneuvering is simplistic, it provides a warning of how strategic competition can undermine resilience, hard-fought, hard-won resilience, and contribute to fragility. An area where we do see this playing out increasingly so is in the security sector space. Competition between Australia and China for influence in Solomon Islands security sector has increased significantly after the 2021 riots. In 2022, China announced for the first time that it was a direct security stakeholder in the Pacific, and it's never used that terminology before, despite the fact that over the last 5-10 years, it has progressively built up its relationships with militaries and police forces across the region. So in the Solomons, China is a nascent but a rapidly expanding security partner to Solomon Islands, entering a security sector long dominated by Australia as Solomon Islands' security partner of choice. This has led to a number of incidents. I'll go very, very quickly over the last year or so, including public concern following as part of the rearmament process, which Australia is leading, is partnering with Solomon Islands on. Roughly 90 assault rifles were part of that package, including training, etc., for the RSIPF. But that created a great deal of public concern in a country where weapons have so closely associated with violence and instability. Similarly, China has also engaged in some really, really disruptive activities, importing, for example, 95 replica rifles for training, but doing so in a way which actually bypassed local customs and created enormous amount of concern. What this has led to is opposition leaders warning against the militarization of Solomon Islands by its two security partners. And the Prime Minister, and we have to remember here, Pacific countries, despite a lot of the rhetoric that we see in the media, they have agency and sovereignty. They know exactly how they're going to leverage this, which is why this quote is so important, because it's an important reminder, actually, of what has taken place for a very long period. So the Prime Minister Sogavare has sought to publicly balance these two security stakeholders, both Australia and New Zealand. But what he's also done is demonstrate through a number of speeches that his primary concern is actually internal threats and the threat to his position and also to his legacy. And this is where there are significant concerns that the security pact that Solomon Islands signed with China in early 2022 could potentially be triggered. Concerningly also is the possibility of, however remote, although there's a lot of thinking about this, rightly so, of negative interactions between multiple security actors on the ground, and I include Aotearoa in that as well. Australia has voiced its concern about how effectively Australian and Chinese police forces currently on the ground would be able to cooperate, particularly with respect to unity of command, for instance, and there are concerns too about the way in which there's a number of potential areas of friction coming up with respect to the Pacific Games, general elections, and so forth. So the potential for strategic competition in the Solomon Islands is, for it to be disruptive, is considerable, and potentially it will continue to intensify. In late 2022, the PIF, the Pacific Islands Forum, made this assessment in its Pacific Security Outlook. So security cooperation in Solomon Islands is likely to remain and increasingly become a contested site because of these plausible points of friction between Australian and Chinese security personnel on the ground. And the implications for Solomon Islanders is significant and deeply troubling because the legacies of the tensions have still yet to be resolved. And this is where I will end now, thank you, but just by saying that whilst we talk about strategic competition and are obviously acknowledging the considerations that we're discussing here and beyond, it's vital to not forget the way in which it's actually impacting people 4 or 5 hours away from Auckland, and people who are still reconciling with an enormous amount of violence, the legacies of violence in their lives. So thank you. Thanks.